I never thought I'd be telling this story. 10 years of marriage, 13 years together. And one morning you wake up to realize everything you believed and was built on shifting sand. They say hindsight is 20/20, and looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I missed or chose to ignore. But let me start from the beginning. I'm Mike Thompson, a software engineer at one of those tech companies in Silicon Valley that everyone pretends to know but can't quite remember the name of. My wife, well, now ex-wife Jennifer, we all called her Jen, worked as a marketing director at a bigger, more famous tech company, the kind whose name everyone definitely knows. We had what most people would call the American dream. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, matching Teslas in the driveway, and our pride and joy, our 8-year-old son Tommy, who was already showing promises of being the next baseball prodigy. From the outside, we were that perfect Silicon Valley power couple everyone loved to hate. But perfection, as I've learned, is often just an Instagram filter over reality. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember it clearly because it was the day of a major product launch at work, and I was already stressed about the deployment schedule. Jen was rushing out the door, laptop bag slung over her shoulder, her dark hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She didn't kiss me goodbye. It seems like such a small thing now, but that was our ritual, a quick peck on the lips, a love you, and then off to our respective tech empires. That morning, she just walked past me, phone pressed to her ear, mouthing running late before disappearing through the garage door. I brushed it off. We all have our off days, especially in Silicon Valley where burnout is practically a badge of honor. But then more little things started piling up. Her iPhone was always face down on the table, a new habit that my engineer's brain couldn't help but notice. She started going to the gym more often, buying new clothes, paying more attention to her appearance than she had in years. Again, nothing suspicious on its own. Self-improvement is practically a religion in the Bay Area. But then came the late-night work emails that made her smile at her phone in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. And the team dinners that kept getting more and more frequent. Tommy started noticing too, in that painfully honest way that kids do. "Why doesn't Mom come to my baseball games anymore?" he asked one Saturday morning as I was helping him with his gear. I made up some excuse about her being busy at work, but the truth was, I was starting to wonder the same thing. The name James started appearing in her conversations more frequently. James Parker, her new boss, recently divorced, apparently some kind of marketing genius who'd been brought in to revolutionize their department. James thinks we should de-pivot our strategy. James had this brilliant idea. James and I need to work late on the new campaign. James. I'm embarrassed to admit how long it took me to connect the dots. Maybe I didn't want to see it. It's easier to debug code than to debug your marriage, after all. The night everything fell apart was, ironically, after one of Tommy's best baseball games. He'd hit his first home run, and the pride on his face as he rounded those bases was something I'll never forget. Jen wasn't there to see it. She had another team dinner with James to discuss quarterly projections. After dropping Tommy off at my sister's place for a sleepover, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I followed my wife. Silicon Valley might be the tech capital of the world, but there's something primitively low-tech about following your wife's Tesla through the streets of Palo Alto. She didn't drive to the office. She didn't drive to any restaurant. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of one of those luxury apartment complexes in Mountain View, the kind where young tech millionaires live before they upgrade to their Palo Alto mansions. I watched her walk into the building, greeting the doorman like she'd done it 100 times before. My hands were shaking as I parked my car a block away. The complex had floor-to-ceiling windows, another Silicon Valley architectural cliché that was about to work in my favor. I walked around the building, trying to look like just another tech bro taking an evening stroll while checking out real estate prices. That's when I saw them. Third floor, corner unit. Jen and a tall, well-dressed man I recognized from her company's website, as James Parker. They weren't discussing quarterly projections. Unless quarterly projections now involve passionate kissing and wandering hands. I felt like I was going to throw up. 20 years of writing code had taught me to always have a backup plan, to never push to production without testing, to always have a rollback strategy. But nothing in my engineering career had prepared me for this. I was about to turn away. There's only so much a man can take when something happened that changed everything. In their passion, they stumbled backward over what looked like an expensive leather ottoman. James went down hard, his head missing the modern glass coffee table by inches. The sound of his cry of pain was audible even through the window. I don't know what possessed me in that moment, but I found myself walking to the building's front door. The same doorman who had greeted Jen so familiarly buzzed me in without question. Another security vulnerability that the engineer and me couldn't help but notice. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, my heart pounding with each floor that passed. When I knocked on the door of Unit 304, there was a moment of panic on the other side. I could hear hushed voices, hurried movements. When Jen opened the door, her face went through a series of emotions that I'd normally need a high-speed camera to capture. Surprise, fear, guilt, and finally, resignation. "Mike," she said, my name coming out as barely a whisper. "Quarterly projections?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Behind her, James was on the floor, clutching his leg, his face a mask of pain both physical and metaphorical. "I think he needs medical attention," I said, stepping into the apartment. The place looked exactly like what you'd expect from a newly divorced tech executive. Minimalist furniture, abstract art, a view of the Samsung research campus in the distance. "Mike, I can explain," Jen started, but I cut her off. "No need," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm calling an ambulance. Your boyfriend seems to have had an accident." The next hour was surreal. I watched as paramedics loaded James into an ambulance, his repeated apologies sounding hollow in the modern lobby. Jen stood there, tears streaming down her face, smearing the makeup she'd so carefully applied for her team dinner. "I'll drive you home," I said after the ambulance left. "We need to talk." The drive back to Palo Alto was silent, broken only by the occasional ping of our phones, probably updates about James's condition in their private chat. Another Silicon Valley story was about to unfold, but this one wouldn't be making TechCrunch's headlines. Or maybe it would. I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do with this information. All I knew was that my perfectly coded life had just encountered a fatal error, and for once, I had no idea how to debug it. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and autopilot parenting. I threw myself into work, debugging other people's problems because I couldn't debug my own. Tommy kept asking when Mom would be home for dinner again. I kept making excuses. Jen had moved into a hotel, giving us both space to think. Space to think, Silicon Valley's favorite euphemism for "I got caught cheating with my boss." It was during one of those endless nights of staring at code that wasn't going to fix itself that I got a text from Chris. Chris and I went way back to our Stanford days, before he chose the Marines and I chose Silicon Valley. "Beer," his text read, simple and direct, just like him. An hour later, I was sitting across from him at the Old Pro, our usual spot in downtown Palo Alto. "You look like shit," he said by way of greeting. I gave him a brief rundown of what had happened, my voice flat and emotionless, like I was describing a particularly problematic bug in someone else's code. Chris listened, his face darkening with each detail. "You know what your problem is?" he said finally, signaling for another round. "You're thinking like an engineer, looking for a clean solution. Sometimes you need to fight fire with fire." "What do you mean? They destroyed your life, didn't they? Maybe it's time to end the favor." I started to protest, but Chris cut me off. "Think about it. They're both high-level tech executives. What happens when HR finds out about their little affair? What happens when their perfect social media profiles get a dose of reality? The beer must have been stronger than usual, because suddenly Chris's words didn't sound crazy at all. I'm not talking about anything illegal, he continued, reading my expression. Just karmic justice. That night, I couldn't sleep for a different reason. I started planning. As a senior software engineer, I had access to tools and knowledge that most people didn't. I created a new email account using a secure VPN. I gathered evidence, screenshots of their late-night meetings, security camera footage from James's apartment complex, timestamps of their team dinners. I wrote a detailed email to their company's HR department, attaching everything I had. But I didn't stop there. I created anonymous social media accounts and started dropping hints about their affair in industry forums. I may have also written a script that automatically downvoted all of James's posts on LinkedIn. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Definitely. The effects were immediate and devastating. Both Jen and James were put on administrative leave pending an investigation. Their carefully curated social media presence began to crumble as rumors spread through Silicon Valley's gossip networks. I watched it all unfold from behind my multiple VPNs, feeling a sense of satisfaction that I'm not proud of now. But karma, as it turns out, has a way of coming back around. The first sign that my revenge plan might have some unintended consequences came from Tommy's teacher. Miss Mitchell, Sarah, called me in for a parent-teacher conference. She was new, having started at the school just after the new year. I hadn't paid much attention during the back-to-school night, too wrapped up in my own drama. But sitting across from her in that tiny classroom chair, I couldn't help but notice how her green eyes seemed to see right through my carefully constructed facade. Tommy's grades are slipping, she said gently, and he's been acting out in class, getting into fights during recess. My stomach dropped. Fights? Tommy's never been in a fight in his life. Sarah nodded, pushing a folder across her desk. Yesterday, another boy was talking about some rumors he'd heard from his parents. About Tommy's mom and her boss. The satisfaction I'd felt watching Jen and James's lives unravel turned to ash in my mouth. Kids can be cruel, Sarah continued, but they usually learn it from somewhere. She wasn't judging, but I felt judged anyway. I thought I was protecting him, I said quietly, by making sure everyone knew the truth. The truth, Sarah said, gathering her papers, isn't always what heals us. I left that meeting feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. That evening, I found Tommy in his room, half-heartedly playing with his baseball cards. Hey, buddy, I said, sitting on the edge of his bed. Want to talk about what happened at school? He shrugged, that universal kid gesture that means both everything and nothing. Jimmy said Mom's a bad person, he finally mumbled, that she did something wrong with her boss. I told him to shut up. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of my revenge pressing down on me. Is Mom a bad person, Dad? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I hadn't considered. No, buddy, I said finally. Mom's not a bad person. She made a mistake, a big one, but that doesn't make her bad. Then why did you make everyone hate her? Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. I had no answer for that. That night, I started undoing what I could. I deleted the anonymous social media accounts. I sent a follow-up email to HR clarifying some of my initial allegations. It wouldn't undo the damage completely, but it might stop the bleeding. The next day, I called Jen. She answered on the first ring, her voice wary. We need to talk, I said, about Tommy and everything else. We met at a small coffee shop in Mountain View, neutral territory. Jen looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of Silicon Valley's finest cold brew could fix. I'm sorry, she said before I could speak. Not just for, but for everything. For breaking us. I nodded, stirring my coffee absently. I'm sorry too, I said, surprising both of us. Not for discovering the truth, but for how I handled it afterward. I lost my job, she said quietly. James too. The whole department is being restructured. I know. Was that your goal? To destroy everything? I thought about Tommy, about his question whether his mom was a bad person. At first, yes, I admitted. I wanted you to hurt like I was hurting. But now, now I just want Tommy to be okay. She reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close. Me too, she whispered. We spent the next hour talking, really talking for the first time in months, about what went wrong, about our mistakes, about how to move forward. We agreed to start marriage counseling, not to save our marriage, that ship had sailed, but to learn how to co-parent without destroying each other. As I watched Jen walk back to her car, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had been driving me wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something else, something that felt a lot like the beginning of forgiveness. That evening, I had another beer with Chris. "You're going soft," he said when I told him about my change of heart. Maybe I was, but as I drove home, I thought about what Sarah had said about truth and healing. Sometimes the hardest bugs to fix are the ones we create ourselves. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's learning to let go. Life has a funny way of forcing you to grow when you least expect it. In the months that followed, I learned more about myself than I had in the previous 40 years. Our marriage counselor, Dr. Rodriguez, helped Jen and me establish new boundaries and communication patterns. Not to save our marriage. We both knew that was beyond repair, but to build something new from the ashes. A partnership focused on the only thing that still mattered: Tommy. Jen found a new job at a startup in San Francisco. Less prestigious than her previous position, but maybe that was what she needed. A fresh start, away from the ghosts of her past mistakes. I threw myself into being the best dad I could be. Every morning, I drove Tommy to school, our car rides filled with conversations about baseball stats and his latest Minecraft creations. And every morning, I found myself looking forward to seeing Sarah, Miss Mitchell, at drop-off. She had this way of making everyone feel seen, even during the chaos of morning arrivals. "Tommy's doing much better," she told me one morning, as Tommy ran off to join his friends. "The nightmares about us fighting have stopped," I said, "and his grades are improving." She smiled, that warm, genuine smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "And how are you doing, Mr. Thompson?" The question caught me off guard. Nobody had asked me that in a while. "I'm getting there," I answered honestly. She nodded, understanding in those green eyes. One day at a time, right? One day at a time indeed. Those days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Tommy's baseball team made it to the Little League Championships. I sat in the bleachers with my laptop, trying to balance work and dad duties. Jen sat a few rows away, having taken the afternoon off from her new job. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either. We were something else, something without a proper Silicon Valley buzzword to define it. Strike three. You're out. The umpire's call snapped me back to the present. Tommy had just struck out the final batter. His team had won. He looked up at the stands, beaming with pride. And for the first time in months, both his parents were there to see it. After the game, as families celebrated around us, Jen approached me. "He's really thriving," she said, watching Tommy with his teammates. "Yeah, he is. Listen, Mike, I've been thinking. James got a job offer in Seattle." My stomach tightened. "Are you?" "No," she said quickly. "I'm not going with him. That's over. Has been for a while." But it made me realize something. What's that? That sometimes the worst mistakes lead us where we need to be. I thought about that a lot that evening. About mistakes and consequences, about growth and change. The next morning, after dropping Tommy off, I found myself walking Sarah to her classroom. "Coffee," I blurted out, then immediately wished I could control plus Z that moment. "I'm sorry. Would you like to eat coffee sometime? With me? Outside of school?" The seconds before she answered felt longer than any code compilation I'd ever waited for. "I'd like that," she said finally. We met that weekend at a small coffee shop in downtown Palo Alto. Away from the school, Sarah was even more engaging. She told me about growing up in Minnesota, about her decision to move to California to teach. I told her about my journey from coding prodigy to father to whatever I was becoming now. One coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekend hikes in the hills above Stanford. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was writing new code instead of trying to debug old errors. But with Tommy involved, we took things slow. Sarah understood that better than anyone. She was a teacher. After all, she knew how delicate children's hearts could be. The first time she came over for dinner, Tommy was understandably wary. But Sarah had a secret weapon. She was genuinely interested in what he had to say. She asked about his baseball games, listened to his detailed explanations of Minecraft redstone mechanics, and even helped him with his math homework. By the end of the evening, he was showing her his baseball card collection. "She's nice," he said after she left. "Yes, she is. And she makes you smile. Like real smiles. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed." Telling Jen about Sarah was another hurdle. We met for coffee, something we did periodically now to discuss Tommy-related matters. "I'm seeing someone," I said. Jen nodded, stirring her latte. "Tommy's teacher, right?" Sarah. I shouldn't have been surprised she knew. Silicon Valley might be big, but parent circles were small. "Are you okay with that?" She was quiet for a moment. "You deserve to be happy, Mike. We both do. Just different kinds of happy than we thought we'd have." As spring turned to summer, life fell into a new rhythm. Tommy split his time between our houses. Weekdays with Jen, weekends with me. Sarah became a regular presence in our lives, but never tried to replace Jen. She had her own unique relationship with Tommy. Part teacher, part friend, part whatever he needed her to be. One evening, as we sat on my back patio watching Tommy practice his pitching, Sarah turned to me. "You know what I love about baseball?" she asked. "What's that?" "No matter how many strikes you get, there's always another at-bat. Another chance to hit it out of the park." I looked at her, understanding the metaphor. "Are you saying I hit it out of the park?" She laughed, that genuine laugh that still made my heart skip a beat. "I'm saying you turn a potential strikeout into a base hit. And sometimes that's even more impressive." Tommy jogged over, face flushed with exertion. "Dad, can Sarah come to my game on Saturday?" I looked at Sarah, who smiled. "I wouldn't miss it," she said. Later that night, after Tommy was in bed, I sat at my computer staring at the blank screen. I opened my code editor, but instead of working, I found myself writing a different kind of document. A letter to my future self, perhaps, or maybe just a reminder of how far I'd come. "Debug log," I typed. "Status: system recovery successful. New features implemented. Old bugs resolved. Running stable." I paused, then added, "Note to self: sometimes the best code isn't the one you originally wrote. Sometimes it's the one you create after everything crashes." I looked out the window at the Silicon Valley night, the Samsung Research Campus lights twinkling in the distance like stars. Somewhere out there, Jen was probably working late at her startup, chasing her own version of redemption. James was in Seattle, debugging his own life's code. And here I was, with a son who was thriving, a new relationship that made me believe in second chances, and a peace I never thought I'd find again. The American dream hadn't ended. It had just been rewritten, and maybe that was the best debug of all.